very much, Bennett. Do you want me to keep the video on?
We can try for now.
Okay, all righty. Well, I'm very sorry I can't be with all of you, and I regret it very much. But we'll just have to do this digitally, I guess. So I do have one graphic to show later if that works, but otherwise I'm just going to talk to you. My introduction to the meat and poultry industry began in 1987 when I directed a study of relations between new immigrants and established residents in Garden City, Kansas. Refugees from Vietnam and migrants from Mexico were flocking to Garden City to work in its 2 beef plants. We soon realized that to understand the social and economic forces at play in Garden City, we needed to understand the beef industry itself. Our study of ethnic relations in Garden City concluded in 1990, but our research on meatpacking's consequences for its workers and host communities had only just begun. It has taken my research partners and me to farms and ranches from Oklahoma to Alberta and from Maryland to Manitoba. We have listened to packing house workers describe their jobs over beers and stood alongside them as they wielded knives and saws on the kill and fabrication floors. We have listened to them describe dismal working conditions and disabling injuries in courtrooms and in living rooms. And we have worked with educators, clergy, healthcare providers, police, and concerned citizens, first in Garden City, Kansas, later in Guymon, in Lexington, Nebraska, Guymon, Oklahoma, Seabury, Kentucky, and Brooks, Alberta, Canada, as they grapple with the massive changes and daunting challenges packing houses bring to their towns. The 3 decades we have spent studying the meat and poultry industry have taught my colleagues and I the human cost of our meat for those who make it and for the communities in which they live and work. Before I continue, I want you to know that I have no prior experience with Prestige. And I also wanted to make it clear that I am not anti-meat industry. I am an enthusiastic meat eater, and the meat that I so enjoy has to come from somewhere. I do believe, however, that the current system of meat production and processing has some serious problems. As an applied anthropologist, I have tried to make my research useful for communities, producers, processing workers, and meatpacking companies themselves. My colleagues and I have taken what we have learned in Garden City, Lexington, Guymon, Seabury, and Brooks to other communities, working with them to decide whether they want a meatpacking plant to come to their town. For those communities that have chosen to host a beef or a pork or a chicken plant, we have worked with them to try to modify and mitigate the negative consequences that attend the meat and poultry industry. In working with communities, we have applied what is called the pliancy factor. When a prediction about what will happen in a community is presented to the people of that community, it may alter their behavior and thus alter outcomes. 3 factors limit the pliancy of communities that host meatpacking plants: the nature of the industry, the timing of the interventions, and the approach to development that the community takes. Meatpacking companies promise rural communities economic development and job creation. And the firms do deliver on their promise of jobs. Many communities, rural and urban alike, pursue economic development without considering larger issues of community development. They equate development with jobs and see economic development as the sole means for community maintenance and improvement. But unless economic development results in improved qualities of life, it can actually be detrimental to community development. For many small towns with stagnant or declining economies, the jobs promised by meatpacking firms seem too good to pass up. But jobs like lunches are rarely free. Certainly not in an age when corporations expect public subsidies and tax holidays, when companies threaten to leave host communities for greener pastures unless taxpayers dig ever deeper into their pockets. As our research has shown time and time again, these jobs come with a host of hidden costs to the health and well-being of workers and host communities alike. The low-wage jobs and transient workforces created by the meatpacking industry, coupled with the corporate welfare it demands, harm the quality of life of many communities. Communities can do much to welcome and serve the needs of meatpacking workers and their families, and I have helped several communities do just that. But communities and workers are virtually powerless to alter the nature of modern meatpacking, since they have no control over the production process. And it is to that production process that I would now like to turn. The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's damning expose of packing houses of Chicago, is now more than a century old. Packing houses in the early 21st century are a far cry from those he described in the early 20th. But for all their computerization and laser technology, their robotics and ergonomics, the knife, the meat hook, and the steel are still the basic tools of the trade. And today's plants remain, like the ones they replaced, rigidly organized, labor-intensive factories that turn animals into meat. Working on the line in a packing house is physically demanding. Workers remain on their feet most of the day and perform the same repetitive motions thousands of times during their shift. Whether it's halving hog carcasses with a hydraulic splitting saw, dropping heads, or artfully cutting meat into retail portions, which will be vacuum packed and sent directly to a supermarket's meat counter. Work in a meatpacking plant has always been dangerous. Meatpacking workers are required to wear hard hats, safety glasses, earplugs, steel-toed and rubber-soled boots, and an amazing array of additional gear intended to protect them from injury. Even so, meatpacking was among the most dangerous industries in America for the last quarter of the 20th century. Although rates have come down in recent years, line workers in meat and poultry in the meat and poultry industry still face the highest occupational injury and illness rate of any manufacturing job in the United States. The industry also has a higher employee turnover rate than any other in the country. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports injury and illness rates for the meatpacking industry as 2.5 times higher than the national average. Serious injuries requiring work restrictions or days away from work are more than 3 times higher in meatpacking than in U.S. industries as a whole. These hazards include exposure to high noise levels, dangerous equipment, slippery floors, musculoskeletal disorders, and hazardous chemicals such as ammonia. Meatpacking is one of North America's few remaining manufacturing industries where a high school diploma, previous work experience, and the ability to speak English are not necessary for employment. These characteristics help explain why today's meat and poultry industry relies heavily on immigrants and refugees. Typical of the industry overall, 2/3 of employees in a meatpacking plant I studied a few years ago were Hispanic, 1/4 were white, and 1/10 Asian. But overall figures were misleading. 3/4 of the plant's officials and managers were white males. 7% were white females, 11% were Hispanic men. Out on the floor, 6 of 10 workers classified as unskilled were Hispanic men, followed by Hispanic women, 13%, white men, 12%. Today, Mexicans and Guatemalans might stand beside workers from Somalia, Myanmar, and the Marshall Islands on the line at this and similar plants. Thanks to low wages and disagreeable working conditions, employee turnover is endemic in meatpacking. For its first 21 months of operation, monthly turnover among line workers at IBP's Lexington, Nebraska plant averaged 12%. When IBP opened the world's largest beef plant near Garden City, Kansas in 1980, turnover reached as high as 60% a month. But the industry average for established plants is around 6 to 8% a month, which still means that at least 72 to 96% of a plant's workforce comes and goes each and every year. The industry's insatiable appetite for workers means that local labor pools are soon exhausted and plants recruit from far and wide. Employees are frequently paid bonuses of $150 to $200 to recruit new workers if they remain on the job past the probationary period, which is usually 90 to 120 days. This practice, in turn, fosters chain migration and the emergence of immigrant enclaves and packing house towns, which often come from specific sending communities. Small towns in the Midwest and South became home to beef, pork, and poultry plants in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as packers shuttered their urban plants and moved to the country to be near their supplies of animals and to cut transportation costs. But these new packing house towns could not supply enough workers for plants reliant on large workforces and prone to high employee turnover. Quickly exhausting local labor supplies, companies recruited farther and farther afield. This translated into dramatic population increases due to the rapid influx of immigrants and refugees, and continuous population mobility in packing house towns throughout North America. What all this means is that turnover is the dominant demographic process in communities that host meat and poultry plants. Population mobility is felt in every aspect of the community: housing, traffic, healthcare, social services, crime, schools, and more. Let me briefly summarize what happened in Guymon, Oklahoma. I chose to talk about Guymon because it is host to a pork plant, and in that regard is similar to Mason City. In 1992, Seaboard Corporation selected the Oklahoma Panhandle town of Guymon as the site of a plant that would eventually slaughter and process about 16,000 hogs a day. Guymon lured Seaboard with land, tax incentives and abatements, and a sales tax to help pay for the plant. The state of Oklahoma also paid for highway improvements. In return, Seaboard promised to pay $175,000 a year to the school system for 25 years. It also promised to create jobs, and it did. According to company figures, 2,800 workers were employed by September 1998 when the plant was fully operational. Salaries ranged from $15,000 a year to more than $70,000. But 9 out of 10 workers made $25,000 or less, while only 1% made $50,000 or more. With 9 out of 10 jobs at the plant paying less than $25,000, the number of families living below the poverty line rose to 10%. Following my suggestion, Guymon established a homeless shelter, the Oaks of Mamre, that offered temporary housing and 2 meals a day for low-income persons seeking work in the Guymon area. Communities are often seduced by meatpacking companies who describe their jobs as good paying. Some of them certainly are, but 90% of workers in meatpacking plants are hourly line workers whose wages are below or barely above the poverty line. It's my understanding that Prestige said it would start its workers at $13 an hour. At $13 an hour, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, A worker would gross before taxes and withholding $520 a week or $27,000 a year. This is less than $3,000 above the federal poverty level for a family of four, and well below income eligibility for free and reduced price meals in public schools. When Seaboard announced its plans in 1992, there were 39 farms raising a few thousand hogs in the surrounding county. By 1997, Hitch Enterprises, a major cattle feeder in the region, Seaboard, and Val Incorporated, a Spanish-owned agribusiness firm, were producing the bulk of the 90,000 hogs raised in the county. In short, the hog population skyrocketed, but most of the pig farmers went out of business. John Eichert will have more to say on this issue in a few moments. Most of the 28,000 jobs Seaboard promised and delivered to Guymon and the surrounding area did not go to Oklahomans. 9 of 10 workers at the Seaboard plant were Hispanic, most from Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America. 1 in 3 were women. Guymon's population grew by more than 1/3 from 1990 to 2000. Even more striking, the Hispanic share of the town's population tripled from 12% to 38%. The percent of foreign-born persons living in Guymon jumped from 1.5% to 22%. The percentage of persons 5 years of age and older who spoke a language other than English rose from 9% to 33%. 3 years after the Seaboard pork plant opened in Guymon, yearly turnover stood at 98%. That is 8% per month. That turnover was also felt in the community. For example, in 1997, the year Seaboard Corporation opened its plant in Guymon, there were over 2,000 new residential utility connections in town. But by April 1998, only 1/3 were still active. Are you still with me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I just was checking. Well, I hear you. Okay, Guymon's public schools experienced a mobility rate, that is a turnover rate, of 25%. Guymon, like other packing house towns I've studied, had a hard time providing permanent, affordable housing. Several mobile home parks opened and apartment complexes and single-family dwellings were built. But the increase in new housing was well below the population growth rate, and occupancy rates for rental units approached 100%. The new homes that were built were generally too expensive for line workers to afford. Compounding the problem, rents increased. As a result, many of those who came to Guymon seeking work simply could not afford to live there, given prevailing wages, rents, deposits, and down payments. Some workers commuted from as far as 100 miles away. Seaboard offered health insurance after 90 days, but given high turnover, many employees never qualified for insurance, and others did not insure family members because they could not afford the monthly payments. Working conditions, combined with a workforce that is impoverished, poorly educated, and transient, strained the healthcare system. Guymon's hospital experienced increased demand for obstetrics and emergency room visits, an increase in uncollected bills, and a drop in net income. Effective service provision was also hampered by a shortage of Spanish-speaking service providers. In fact, for a time, they used a janitor as their translator.
My bad.
Students requiring English as a second language instruction rose dramatically. 2 years after the plant opened, Hispanics accounted for 45% of the student body, up from 29% 5 years earlier. During the same period, the district's graduation rate dropped from 83 to 72%. Crime also increased in Guymon, which is to be expected in any rapidly growing community. Calls for service rose 30% over the 5-year period spanning construction of the plant and its first full year of operation. Accidents increased 34%, and total arrests went up 38%. In response, the police force added 5 new officers. The police chief acknowledged that many crimes went unreported. The influx of meatpacking workers and their families, as well as those who take low-paying spin-off jobs in the service sector, place additional strain on healthcare services.
All right, let's take this guy off video.
Because rural areas generally suffer shortage of physicians and other healthcare professionals. Long hours, unpredictable work schedules, and heavy patient loads often translate into physicians' unwillingness to accept new patients. Low-wage workers and their families often resort to the emergency room for routine healthcare needs. Language and cultural barriers add to the challenges of healthcare delivery to newcomers. Many lack English language skills, which complicates patient diagnosis. On the surface, providing translators seems a simple expedient, but some clients may refuse to share their particular symptoms with someone from the same community or fear their condition will become public. And programs like Language Line have practical limitations. While this problem will eventually be solved as the second generation achieve fluency in English, it remains a barrier. And the changing face of meatpacking's immigrant workforce is constantly presenting new linguistic and cultural challenges. With Seaboard's arrival, Guymon joined a number of similar communities: Dodge City, Garden City, and Liberal in Kansas, Mayfield and Seabury in Kentucky, Lexington and Grand Island in Nebraska, Brooks in Alberta and Brandon in Manitoba, Canada, Storm Lake and Columbus Junction in Iowa. Despite great distance and divergent historical and cultural traditions that separate them, these communities have faced similar challenges: growth, often rapid and explosive, population mobility, dramatic increases in cultural and linguistic diversity, escalating crime, health, and social problems, strain on infrastructure and social services. These challenges stem from a common source: the meat and poultry processing industry's hunger for workers. Packing houses exact a high price in illness and injury for many line workers. They also bring significant social and economic costs to host communities: declining per capita income, housing shortages, increases in population mobility, and rising demands for health care, public safety, education, and indigent care. Employers generally ignore the added costs that come with their workforces. These costs fall on local residents who, in addition to paying higher taxes, give of their time and money to support food banks, homeless shelters, and other newcomer services. I want to just, since we've got video, I want to quickly screen, if you can see this. You see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, this is basically I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I've already talked about it, but these are the basic areas of common concern in meatpacking towns that I and others have studied, not only in the United States, but in Canada. There is dramatic growth, and in addition to that growth, continuous turnover, because there's an inadequate local labor force, and so there's an influx of new workers. Initially, the workers are largely single males, but after a while, they bring their families. Worker turnover leads to high mobility in the community, and growth is dependent upon the availability of housing. If there's adequate housing, you'll see substantial growth. If not, people will commute in from elsewhere. There's basically two kinds of housing that's needed: temporary or transitional housing. Meatpacking workers come with limited resources. They will need a place to stay temporarily until they draw their initial paychecks and are able to find more permanent housing and permanent housing that's affordable. This often translates into trailer parks. Initially, often workers are sleeping in their cars, in motels. They're often sleeping in shifts in cheap motel rooms. So it's a serious problem until affordable housing becomes sufficiently available, and that often is never really happens. When I was working in Garden City in 2013, studying the school system, the housing rental market was completely full. And so I, like many newcomer workers in Garden City, had to live with friends. Health, meatpacking, as I've already said, is dangerous work. Insurance is not available to new workers immediately. Not all workers can afford to or choose to insure their family members. There will be increases in certain diseases and health problems, increases in alcohol and drug issues, increases in sexually transmitted diseases, increases in things like tuberculosis, and most importantly, an increase in demand on the healthcare system, which will spill over into people that have insurance as well, because doctors can only serve so many folks. Education, enrollment, student turnover, and dropout rates will increase. There will be a greater ethnic and linguistic diversity. I've studied Garden City now for 30 years. Currently, the Garden City school system is 75% children of color. About 65% are Latino or Hispanic. The rest are Asian and African, largely from Somalia and Ethiopia. About half of the students are English language learners. About 70% of the students are eligible for free and reduced price lunches. So you're going to see a greater ethnic and linguistic diversity. Social services, there will be an increased demand for both governmental and non-governmental agencies to provide services. The clientele needing those services is going to become much more diverse in terms of language, culture, and ethnicity. Service providers tend to be native-born Anglos, generally monolingual English speakers, often women. But their clientele they serve will be increasingly ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse. Law enforcement, there will be an increase in demand for traffic, or increases in traffic, pardon me, excuse me, and traffic accidents. There will be an increase in crime, not because meatpacking workers are more criminal, but because they tend to be young, and young men are those folks that are most at risk for committing and for being victims of crime. And finally, communication. Many of the newcomers will be limited English speakers, but communication is about more than language. It's also often about culture, and there will be significant cultural differences between established residents and newcomers, and also between packing house workers and folks who earn their living from in other ways. So with that, I've run through basically sort of what happens to meatpacking plants. I've studied a number of them now, and it's essentially saying whether packing, beef packing, or poultry, the consequences for communities are invariably the same. So thank you for hearing me out. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm sorry I can't be there personally, but I will now relinquish my microphone and turn it back to Bennett and to the removal of the program.